Bienvenidos a Tres Respuestas, un espacio de conversación, de diálogo y de propuestas. Hoy tenemos un invitado muy especial. Se trata de un muy buen amigo, Daniel Weiss. Daniel Weiss es una persona con una trayectoria increíble en el mundo de las inversiones de capital a nivel mundial y en los Estados Unidos, principalmente asociadas con la economía verde, con las energías renovables, también con nuevos desarrollos de almacenamiento de energía. Y es el fundador y managing partner del fondo conocido como Angeleno Group, que ya tiene varias décadas, varios fondos exitosos y son reconocidos como el fondo que hizo la primera oferta pública inicial de energía solar en los mercados de valores de los Estados Unidos. Daniel Weiss tiene también una trayectoria como ambientalista, es miembro de la Junta de EE.UU y es también filántropo. Es abogado californiano, formado también en UCLA y tiene una trayectoria que es verdaderamente increíble. Daniel, such a pleasure to have you in Tres Respuestas.
El placer es mío, Presidente. It really is wonderful to be with you. And thank you for that kind, if undeserved, introduction. But thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, when I was describing your career, your accomplishments, all the things that you've done, but also considering that you're such an amazing human being that has so much vision, passion, knowledge, and at the same time, humbleness, I definitely have to ask a regular question that I always bring up to this podcast. Who is Daniel Weiss? How would you define yourself and how would you describe your life path to become the person that you are today?
Well, it's kind of you to ask that question. As you alluded to, I'm a California kid. So I grew up here in Los Angeles, California, the child of two teachers. Both of my parents, who met in New York in graduate school at Columbia, came out here to Los Angeles to UCLA. And I grew up here, really was blessed in many ways to grow up in an environment that celebrated learning and intellectual curiosity. And I think in many ways that's informed my my professional trajectory. I'm a big fan of Los Angeles and of California, a product of all public schools here in Los Angeles, and then going to Berkeley for college and Stanford for graduate school for a couple of different degrees. So deeply committed and invested in the California project and experiment. And I think that there's some relationship probably between that and my experience growing up here and what we do now at Angeleno Group, as you said, investing in sustainability and the clean energy economy.
Dan, when you decided to enter your career, you mentioned to me that you started wanting to be a lawyer, that you were working in a law firm, but also you had this passion for politics. You were close to former governors, and you had mentors from different kinds of legal application of knowledge. But all of a sudden, with who then became your business partner, you decided to create a fund. And at that time, even though it was a very important moment for private equity globally, funds that were focused on sustainability were not very common nor so popular. How was that decision? What made you, take the path, take the risk of saying, you know what, instead of being in a law firm, I definitely want to go and have this chance. And how did Angeleno begin?
Well, it's interesting. The story is sort of fresh in my mind, to tell you the truth, Ivan, because I just came back a week and a half ago or so from giving a guest lecture at Stanford Law School on climate investing. And the students asked a similar question, which is, how did you do this? Where did you make this pivot from practicing law to becoming an institutional investor? And really, as I shared with them, some of the origin story took place about 150 feet from the lecture hall where we were sitting in Stanford. Um, and it started with a relationship. You alluded to some key mentors. One of them was a man named Warren Christopher. Warren Christopher, as you may know, is the former Secretary of State in the United States under President Bill Clinton, but he was also chairman of the oldest and largest law firm at the time in Los Angeles called O'Melveny and Myers. And he became a key mentor of mine. I met him when I was a young law student in my 20s. He ended up recruiting me to join his firm after I graduated. And the relevance of that to Angeleno Group is that Chris, as he's referred to by many who know him or knew him, Chris was on the board of one of the largest power companies in the Western United States called Edison International. And as a result of that, we did a lot of work for large energy companies at the firm. And I look back on this now, Yvonne, in retrospect, and I must say it seems incredibly naive and arguably foolish, but it seemed to us that there was this big white space in the energy private equity world. Almost a barbell, if you will, looking back on it then, where on one end of the barbell, there were well-established private equity investors investing in capital-intensive large energy projects, power plants, drilling rigs, pipelines, things of that sort. On the other end of the barbell were institutional investors that were investing, really hedge funds, in commodity price arbitrage around oil and natural gas. But it seemed to us, again, this may seem rather naive in retrospect, that in the middle, there was a dearth, a lack, a scarcity of institutional investors investing in the future of this $6 or $7 trillion vertical of the global economy known as energy, what was then called alternative energy. And so, after a fair bit of time and consideration and research, I actually went to Chris after talking to my co-founder and asked him if he thought this was a crazy idea to start a venture capital and investment firm to go after this white space. And I don't think I'll forget it anytime soon. Chris, who, for those who knew him, was a pretty buttoned down, formal guy, the kind of person that you'd expect waking up in the morning, getting out of bed and already having his tie on. And I was kind of bracing myself for, you're a little crazy, Daniel. Why do you want to leave the practice of law at a great law firm and start an investment firm when you have no experience or track record doing so? And instead, he said, now's the time to take risks in your career, Daniel. And you can always come home. And I'm ready to pick up the phone and help make phone calls if it's useful to you. And so, really, like a lot of institutions, you may have stories like this in your political life. We're standing on the shoulders of other people who believed in us, took risks with us, and encouraged us earlier on in our career. As you said, this was not um, an area of the institutional investment landscape that was widely accepted. In fact, I think in many ways we were perceived as people didn't know what we were doing, fringy, and thought when we showed up in their offices that we were selling Sierra Club memberships or there to hug trees. But they didn't realize in many cases what the vision was for investing in the green economy over the next century.
One day we had a very interesting conversation when you told me a story that I consider this also fundamental in the life of private equity and venture capital funds, which is, who's your first person that really trusted you and said, you know what, I'm going to put a couple of millions of dollars in the fund. And at that time, Stanford University had this very special unit that used to invest resources from their endowment. And there was this very specific genius that had made so much money for the university that looked at the fund and made a decision. Why don't you tell part of that story and how that also became something very important to constitute that first fund, and then something that became even more important that I also want you to tell us and the audience, and it's how did you make the road to have the first IPO of solar energy in the United States, especially in times where IPOs were not seen regularly in this sector, and how that also created a very strong reputation for Angeleno.
Thank you. Yeah, and I should probably correct one aspect of that. I don't know that it's the first initial public offering ever of solar in the United States, but I think it was one of the largest, if not the largest, in the history of the U.S. at that time. But having said that, the Stanford story is an interesting one in the sense that you know, it informs a bit or gives a window perhaps in terms of some of the listeners who may be subjected to this conversation with how kind of new funds get started. And in many cases, it takes an institutional investor to sort of put a stake in the ground and say, we believe in this investment thesis and this team. In our case, that occurred in 2005. So we founded Angeleno Group, as you probably recall, because you have an extraordinary memory, in 2001. My co-founder, Yaniv Tepper, and I, and another co-founder, founded the firm in 2001. We launched our first institutional fund. So we had done some smaller non-institutional investments for a few years. And then we launched our first institutional fund in 2005. And there was a gentleman who ran the division of the Stanford University Endowment named Larry Owen. May he rest in peace. It's actually, it would be his birthday this month. And Larry had an extraordinary reputation as a shrewd investor, had been at the endowment for decades. And he had a thesis that in the real assets and natural resources space, um, that renewables may play a more significant portion of the energy mix globally over the next several decades than it had over the last. And we had known him through some previous institutional investing relationships, including in my partner's previous professional life. And so he really invested in getting to know us and understand this thesis we had come up with. And long story short, they became the anchor tenant in our first institutional fund, for which we are extraordinarily grateful. And so it's been it's an object lesson in how when a significant institutional investor takes a stake, the gates can open up and it can create real validation.
And when you made that decision, okay, I'm going to start with this fund, you worked on that IPO, you got the support from Stanford, you created a name, and then you were successful, which in the world of private equity and venture capital, it's a very beautiful starting place. But then you have to consolidate every time you create a fund in trying to sustain that reputation that you've made, that you can be profitable and that you have a method that is successful. And that takes me to another question. You've been in the business for almost 30 years, almost. And in that experience, most of your funds, if not all, they've all been profitable. And you have made some decisions on the size of the funds, the ways you raise the capital, the way you deploy the capital. What would you say are the key recipes for success in Angeleno to keep that performance in a very ascendant way and with very few defeats?
Well, first of all, you were kind enough to mention that that we are a humble organization, and hopefully the people who work at it embody that perspective. We believe anyway, in our experience, and we have plenty of tire marks on our back to prove it, that one makes mistakes over decades of investing in virtually any field, and we're certainly not exempt from it. As early entrants into the clean energy and climate investing space, we made plenty of mistakes. One of them, for example, where we've evolved and learned over time, is that as a venture and growth equity organization, as opposed to, say, a large infrastructure fund, it's incredibly important to underwrite with a high level of sensitivity capital intensity, right? So when you're investing in funds that are sub $500 million, you got to be cautious about investing in businesses that may require billions of dollars of capex. And so there were many lessons learned along the way about sort of the stage and types of businesses. We invest primarily in services and technology companies, both hard tech and software. But to answer your question, a big part of it is to stay humble, to stay curious, to learn from our mistakes. We literally have an exercise at Angeleno Group that we do periodically after exiting investments, regardless of the outcome, where we just sit down and say, what are lessons learned? What did we do right? What did we do wrong? What can we do better next time? And so we are a investment organization, but hopefully we're a learning organization as well.
Daniel, we are now in a time where the, let's say, the eagerness of the narratives for climate action have been weakened for political reasons. Some would say also for practical reasons, just because of the pressure that the AI revolution is going to create on energy and energy demand. And obviously now you see, for example, governments giving less importance to ESG portfolios. But in this time, you and Angeleno have made the decision not only to double down, but even to go much farther and explore not only the U.S. market but also emerging markets in this areas. How do you see the landscape today of climate action investments, energy and sustainability, and what would you recommend for investors to do in these areas for the years to come? And also for pension funds and even for governments that are still not only believing that this is a moral must, but that there's still a land of opportunities.
Yeah, it's a terrific question because in many ways, we're in a turbulent and confusing moment in the sustainable investing space in Q4 of 2025. There's sort of a zoom in and a zoom out moment, particularly if you're sitting here in the United States. If you zoom in, and you and I had the pleasure of spending a little bit of time with you together at Climate Week in New York in September. If you zoom in to what's happening in the U.S., there's a lot of clouds on the horizon. Things that you were alluding to, certainly in terms of the posture of our federal government, whether it's the announced withdrawal of the Paris Climate Agreement, which will go into effect likely in January of next year, or the recently passed so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, which, as you well know, overturns very significant components of the Inflation Reduction Act, and countless other examples and comments from leaders in the government about climate change, the green economy, etc. On the other hand, you're sitting, I think, in Bogota today, Iván, and as we speak, a little bit further south, the world is convening in Belém, Brazil, and there's an entire other sort of outlook that much of the rest of the world has about the global secular shift to a low carbon economy. that train has left the station. And so, one of the things that struck us when we were at Climate Week in New York is, yes, the largest economy in the world that represents somewhere in the vicinity of 26% of global GDP has taken one position on the green transition. But guess what? That means that 74% of GDP or thereabouts has taken a very different position. Um, and so when you zoom in to the short term, and in the US, there are rocky shoals ahead. But if you zoom out and you look globally and long term, a very different picture emerges. One where the mega trends around decarbonization are well established, where capital is continuing to flow. Interestingly, not much media coverage of this at the moment, but sometimes the capital markets can be canaries in the coal mine, indicators in some ways of where investors see the future going. And here in 2025, year to date, the conventional energy indices, as measured, for example, by the S&P Oil and Gas Index, are actually down, whereas the clean energy indices are up north of 40%. And so there continues to be adoption of new clean and green technologies. Uh, here in Los Angeles, we were just looking at some data. The investments, venture investments in the green economy are actually up something like 24 or 25% year to date. So the capital markets, innovators, entrepreneurs are continuing to pursue opportunities in this space. Our deal flow, candidly, if you walked around sort of the four walls of Angeleno Group today, Iván, I think the consensus would be, in our 20 plus years of doing this, deal flow has never been better in terms of both quantity and quality of investment opportunities in the space. So yeah, there's really sort of a tale of two cities. Again, short term, and maybe here domestically, at least in terms of the posture of the federal government, it's one picture. But when one zooms out and looks globally long term, at least we believe that many of the drivers of the low carbon economy are still intact.
I have two questions, just not only for my curiosity, but also for our listeners. Would you share with us some of your recent investments from Angeleno, and what's the bet behind those investments?
Sure. So I'll tell you an investment that we've recently signed but not announced. So I won't tell you the name of the company, but I'll tell you the type of business that it's in, because it's illustrative, as I think you may be trying to get to, of some of the interesting areas, at least that we're seeing for investment opportunity in the clean energy and climate solution space. So that investment is in a company that works on grid infrastructure. So, as you may know, I think the American Society of Civil Engineers in the United States gives our grid a D plus. So many of the electrons that are delivered today, in fact, including our building in Los Angeles, our offices, were built on or about the time of the Korean War. And a lot's changed since then. And so we have, particularly in a period now of significant load growth, which you've probably read about and are aware of, driven by mega trends like AI, the building out of data centers, the electrification of the economy. We have a strained and inadequate grid infrastructure. And so this most recent investment that we expect to announce in the coming weeks is a company that uses technology to detect potential sparks or arcing in the grid, which may lead to things like wildfires. it also enables the customers to optimize the use of their O&M fleets, their operations and maintenance, where they roll trucks to maintain the transmission distribution infrastructure, to save costs, to enhance efficiencies. So it's addressing issues of climate change and extreme weather events and risks like ones we're very familiar with here in Los Angeles, such as wildfires, but it's also enhancing the efficiency of the grid. And this is kind of a classic value proposition that we look for, which is to say, is there an economic value proposition independent of regulatory drivers when we're underwriting or evaluating investing in a company? And this is a good example of that. The last investment before that, again, for illustrative purposes, is a company called AZZO, AZZO, an EMS company, energy management software company. Sorry to roll out these acronyms, but it works on microgrids. And so it optimizes microgrids and helps the equipment in microgrids communicate. If it's an EV charger, solar installation, an energy storage battery, communicate with each other and with the grid. So these are some of the kinds of investments that we're making. I guess a third example of an investment in our portfolio, which we actually exited earlier this year, is a company called Fictiv, Fictiv, which is a company we sold to a Japanese industrial business called Misumi. This is publicly available information, but it's in the decarbonization of industrial manufacturing space. So they use 3D printing and additive manufacturing to produce industrial prototypes in a way that's cheaper, faster, uses much less energy, something like, I believe, 90% less electricity to produce the prototype, and wastes less materials. So again, an economic value proposition. As far as I understand, I think the acquirer of our portfolio company did it less because of a sustainability mandate and more because they just wanted cutting edge technology to offer their customers to make things cheaper, faster, better in terms of prototypes.
Well, that's just fascinating. I've also been following another trend that is associated with the whole ecosystem of green investment, sustainability, energy, and it has to do with carbon efficiency and obviously carbon accounting. Carbon accounting is taking every week, every day, basically every second more importance, and there are great debates taking place so that even, for example, on traditional energy in sectors difficult to abate, you have to struggle to be more efficient and also be able to decarbonize even within your own restrictions. So I want to ask you, how much importance are you giving to climate accounting or carbon accounting, and how do you see carbon accounting uh, adding value to the analysis that you're going to make eventually for new investments in the year to come?
It's a great question. Carbon markets have been going through a difficult time over the last couple of years, particularly around issues of the integrity, as you well know, of carbon credits. Things like permanence and additionality and leakage, these types of themes have undermined certain aspects of the integrity of at least some high profile examples in voluntary carbon markets. But we're believers, and we may be wrong. We're wrong about many things, but we're believers that on balance over time, externalities associated with pollution need to be priced by the markets. And we believe that carbon markets will be part of that. There have been fits and starts, as you know. We've had some success stories at a subnational level. I think folks may have heard our governor talking about our carbon markets here in California, in Brazil this week. But there's still many imperfections in the carbon markets today. But we believe that they will be hopefully addressed over time and scale over time. We think that's sort of an outcome that makes sense economically. And so, as I think you know, there are some interesting discussions. We just had our Q4 2025 board meeting last week, Iván, here in Los Angeles at Angeleno Group. And carbon markets was one of the issues at the top of the agenda. There are some interesting proposals that are being discussed. Call your attention potentially to an initiative on CBAM, so border adjustment mechanisms. There's some paper and research that's been written about this from the Salata Institute at Harvard University. Some of your listeners may want to take a look at that. It's gained some traction, I believe, in conversations even over recent days in Belém. There are other initiatives underway to take different approaches to pricing carbon markets. And so it is an area that we think has great promise. There's also great peril. It needs to be done right. And we need to be cautious about it, but we're optimistic that there will be some strides and changes and evolution in carbon markets globally over the next 3 to 5 years.
Since I know we're running out of time, I definitely have to switch topic to something that is also part of your heart and your daily work, which is your role as a director in the board of the World Resources Institute, which is also part of your philanthropic life and your involvement in conservation and in protection of nature around the world. How do you see the evolution of philanthropy in the years to come, especially when there's some defunding taking place, maybe with the elimination of USAID, some other agencies from developed countries cutting climate investment through philanthropic organizations? How do you think those gaps will be filled, and who do you think is going to come and play a more powerful role than states when it comes to the deploy of capital through this organization that is pretty much needed around the world?
Well, you point out a really important issue, Yvonne, around the importance of climate finance. And the simple fact of the matter is we have a lot more work to do in that department. So various third parties suggest that we need to spend, as you know, somewhere in the vicinity of $250 trillion to get to net zero by 2050 as a global economy. And we're running somewhere in the vicinity of $3.5 trillion a year short of achieving that objective. So one of the things that I think is being discussed real time in Belém is how do we mobilize more climate finance, particularly in the global south. And so it's an issue that WRI is spending a lot of time thinking about. And we have a very large team, I think one of the largest teams, if not the largest, of any environmental NGO on the ground, to global NGO on the ground in Belém. And it's a very central issue. To answer your question, we think anyway that a lot of it's going to have to come from the private sector. The sort of conventional models of development finance, I think, are being questioned in many hallways around the world. And we need to find ways to unlock and unleash more private sector capital in this space if we're to achieve these kind of monumental goals and scale that we're talking about. So there are some success stories. Perhaps we could call people's attention to a new book that was written actually by the CEO of WRI, Ani Dasgupta, called The New Global Possible. There are reasons for optimism. There are examples in that book and elsewhere about how innovation in the private sector is driving positive change in the global clean economy. Another interesting book that your readers may want to look at or think about in terms of this nexus of science and innovation, policy, and private capital is a book by an atmospheric scientist at MIT named Susan Solomon, who came out with a book last year called Solvable, which looks at a handful of examples from the ozone and the Montreal Protocol to lead and pesticides, where this magical trifecta of science and innovation, thoughtful policy, and then private sector scaling has really addressed significant environmental issues over the last half century. And so there are some reasons for optimism, but we've got a lot of work to do.
Well, I just think you raised a very important topic there. And Dan, my last question, and I hope we can continue these conversations later on. If you were to maybe pick a sector within the scope of climate action and energy transition, which one is the one that you think that's the big bet? That's where you have to be. That's where you have to put some resources. And that's the sector that eventually is going to pick up with a lot of strength. Is it smart grids? Is it storage? Is it maybe micro nuclear generators? What do you think are those, or which is the sector that you definitely are looking with a lot of enthusiasm to invest?
So in answering that question, it's probably important to clarify for your listeners that our investment program, is in the context of 10-year funds. And so we need to, we're long-term in our orientation and interested in businesses that can grow significantly over 3, 5, 7 years, but we're operating under those time frames. So the answer to your question in a 20, 30, 40-year time frame may be different than in a 3, 5, 7 year time frame, which is what we're operating under. And in those time frames, again, it's probably illustrative to look at where we're putting our capital and that of our limited partners today. Gave you one example, a couple of different examples. One, decarbonization of industrial manufacturing. A couple of examples related to smart grid, as you pointed out. I guess a third megatrend that we're paying attention to is the broader electrification of the economy. So when you think of various different devices or technologies that today might be running on hydrocarbons, but tomorrow could be running on electrons. So that could be appliances in the home. Obviously, it applies to the transportation sector, in certain aspects of the industrial economy. But we are believers that sort of the arc of history is moving towards greater electrification of the global economy. And so when there are services and technologies that can be a part of that, and we can get into some examples. I don't know that we'll have time here, but maybe we'll have to do it together, breaking bread in Bogota or Los Angeles or one of the other cities that I get to hang out with you in from time to time. But that's another sort of mega trend that we're paying attention to. And then, of course, to perhaps state the obvious, and we haven't gone into it much today, but the intersection of AI and sustainability. So there is a very, very exciting unlock of opportunity that's going on at the intersection of artificial intelligence and sustainability technologies. In fact, we just published an internal report, which I'm happy to share with you as a friend if you'd like to see it. It's called the 2025 Angeleno Group Reader, Artificial Intelligence, Energy, and Climate, where it's sort of our humble attempt to create a taxonomy of real applications of AI technologies to the clean economy. And so there are, a lot of implications around that, a lot of discussion going on in policy and business circles about load growth, about electron demand. But overall, we see kind of a massive opportunity on the horizon, whether it's in materials science, climate predictive modeling, the applications of AI and software for infrastructure like the grid. There are enormous opportunities for progress and value creation. So those are a few areas we're thinking about.
Well, Daniel, I think this has been a fascinating conversation. It's always great to see you and great to share and exchange ideas with you, but most importantly, learn from your experience and your vision. So thank you for being in Tres Respuestas.
Thank you, President Duque. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for all the work that you're doing with your foundation in civil society. Colombia and the world is lucky to have you.
Thank you so much for those words.